to Spider. So my name is Wayne Pailu, and I'm one of the product managers responsible for application security area. So Spider, how many people heard of Spider? Just that. So we have been in the industry for the last 45 years. So we mostly in test and measurement area. So all the networking protocol technology we cover, from wireless, 5G, IoT, everything we cover. In the last 10 years, we started to focus on the application security. So that's why it started getting to that. And in our product, we have a product that focusing on various types of application testing, from HTTP, multiple kind of traffic. You can emulate as many kind of traffic that you want in your corporation. You can run all kind of malware. You can run the testing of that. And you can have also the DDoS attack. And plus, we also have the project. So one part of it is running all the application that you have in mind, and to validate your application, your services, the system, and your equipment. On the other hand, we have a bunch of these security protocols that you can have. In addition to that, we also have a group called the Security Lab. I believe in one of these things that you pick it up, and those are the consulting firms which allow you to help you to do the security assessment. So this is where we focus in the application and security. So welcome, and I don't want to say too much because everybody wants to listen to what Prashant says. So I'll pass over to Prashant. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, KV and Spiral, for organizing this. I've lost my voice over the past 2 weeks, so if I'm not audible, please let me know. Okay, so before I start, just wanted to go through what we are planning to cover today. So initially, we had planned for a hands-on session where basically I would show you certain techniques and then you would follow through. Unfortunately, due to time limitations, we'll have to cut short on the hands-on part. I'll show you all the things, including doing it on the stage, but I won't be able to right now help you if you want to follow through. If you have any questions later on when you're trying to follow through the slides or anything, let me know. I'll be very happy to help you out. Is that fine with everybody?
Yeah.
Great.
So we'll be able to take all the stuff and try it at home.
Yes. So I've included all the links and everything so you can create your own AD lab at your house and start playing with it. So this is what we're planning for today. So basically start with what are we talking about? What is AD? Everybody keeps talking about. Then basically do some reconnaissance from a passive side, from an unauthenticated side. So we have no idea how to authenticate to a particular Active Directory. Then basically find out how to get the initial foothold. So figure out how do you find what valid usernames are, how do you find the passwords for them, and then basically continue on the presentation for a tool which I wrote, which is called as AD Recon, which basically binds to the AD using LDAP and pulls all the relevant information from the domain controller and puts it out in a different format so you can analyze later on.
Yes. So in case anybody wants to connect to Wi-Fi, red is the user SSID, and this is the user ID password. User ID and password. You can connect to the Wi-Fi.
So does everybody know what AD is? Do people use it every time at the office? Okay, so can I steal the slide? Okay, so just to give a short overview, whenever we are talking about AD, we are talking about the Active Directory Domain Services, which is the role which you add to a Windows server. What it basically lets you do is it's just a centralized, standardized management way to manage a network. You have your users, groups, computers. Just makes it easier to push configuration to different computer objects. And just wanted to give a quick note. This slide, some of the definitions in this slide and some of the other slides in there have been taken from a presentation which is called as Fun with LDAP and Kerberos in AD environments, which was given by Ronnie Flathers at the ThoughtCon conference. So if you want to give This is a presentation which he gave, which is a 2-hour long presentation. Although the video for that is not available, the slides are there. And if you are interested in AD, have a look at those slides. I've only taken certain parts of it which are related to reconnaissance, but he goes through a lot more other attacks as well as other details. So typically what administrators would see when they're trying to create new users, create new computers, change configurations, you'd be using the activity users and computers. So this basically gives you a quick overview of how the current AD environment looks like. So here you have your basic built-in containers and organizational units, which then contain different objects in them. The objects can be user object, computer object, a group object, and a whole lot of others. So before we get into that, if you want to build your own AD lab to play around with, there are certain links which has been documented. The first link is by Sean Metcalf, who is a very well-known researcher in Active Directory. He has made a very long blog post of how he basically creates his own AD lab right from screenshots and other details. Then basically you have other another blog post which does the same thing, and then you have certain GitHub projects which are automated scripts which uses certain news vagrants and virtual box to start up your own environment, including one DC, one client, and logging server and things like that, which works on Mac OS, I think so, Windows and Linux. Then you have automated lab and invoke AD lab deployer. They use Hyper-V to start up the lab for you. Then there are certain other links which helps you push data into it, like create users and other things, so you can have more data to play with. So initially, when you plug into a network, how do you find out whether you're in a network where Active Directory is enabled or not? There are lots of ways in which you can do that. I'm just going to cover a small subset of those, which are DHCP, DNS, the raw LDAP metadata, and NetBIOS. So how many people here know what DHCP is? Right? It's just the thing which gives you an IP address. But DHCP gives you a lot more than just an IP address. Whenever an Active Directory environment is enabled on a network with DNS integrated, then you would see something called as domain name pushed along with the DHCP offer packet, which includes the domain name of the current Active Directory environment there. So whenever you connect, you don't have to always open up Wireshark and see it. There are other tools like Nmap, which basically send out a broadcast packet on your behalf, and it will list down all the information for you. So here it is basically telling you that the DNS name server is at this IP address and the domain name is that. Just exclude the raw characters at the end. Similarly, you can use NSLOOKUP to get all those details. Basically, all of the DNS integrated domain would have these 4 different typeset, which is the underscore GC stands for the global catalog, underscore LDAP is LDAP, this underscore Kerberos related to any Kerberos authentication DNS records which are there, and K password WD. These will basically tell you what is the current global catalog in the environment, which server is acting as the LDAP server, then which active server is acting as the Kerberos authentication server. So in this case, in my environment, I only have one DC right now who is handling all the different things. In case you have multiple, it will show you all the multiple ones in those. If you don't have access to a Windows box, you can do it through Kali as well, or any Linux machine using the dig commands. Just specify the type, which is SRV, and the record. So in this case, the important thing is you need to specify the fully qualified domain name in here. If you don't specify that, you won't get any valid results back. Then also there is NSE script which does the same thing. It will query the DNS server for all the different types of records and basically show you in a format which is easier to understand. And also, if you have any questions or you find I'm going too fast, just let me know. Feel free to stop me at any point. Also, there are certain vulnerability scanners which also do these same things and list it out as a issue in their vulnerability scan report. So Qualys is one of them which does that. It will give you all the DNS records in the list which is with the QID 4023. Unfortunately, I don't have a screenshot of the report to show you for that. Then you have the raw LDAP bind, which will give you a lot more information as well. Now, this information is available unauthenticated directly if you're trying to parse and authenticate as a LDAP. So let me just quickly show you the demos for all these 4 different categories. So in this case, this is a Kali VM which I have set up. Let me just quickly walk you through the environment. So this is the domain controller which I have set up, which is sitting on the IP address 192.168.9.10. And then I've got a domain member, which is a Windows 7 64-bit machine. Then I've got this Kali VM, which is also not bound to the domain. And here I've got a Windows 10 machine, which is also not a member of the domain. So let's quickly start up Wireshark and see that packet. Does anybody remember the filter for DHCP in Wireshark? For some reason, I can't see the offer. That's strange. Okay. All right. Let's just do the nmap one.
You need the filter.
Yeah, if you have it. All right. Bootp params. So here you can see is the same screenshot. We have got the DHCP offer coming through. Initially, our system sent in the request, which was acknowledged by the DHCP server, and basically got the offer, which has got the domain name as sos.labs in this case. Similar thing, you can do it with nmap. It's not visible. Just turn one. The Zoom does not work in the VM. Okay. Is it better? Yeah. Okay. So you've got the DHCP offer packet in that which is sent from the DNS server, DHCP server, sorry, and then you get the domain name. Let's do the same thing from Nmap. You basically don't need to specify any parameters. It will automatically send a broadcast packet for DHCPs, and it will parse out the DHCP offer packet and show you all the information for you. And then, do you want me to go through the DNS records once? Because it's nothing different than what is shown in the screenshot. All right. Okay, we'll just jump to the LDAP one. So for LDAP, basically, I use a utility called as LDAP admin, which is you get. It's a freely available binary. The source code is available as well if you want to go through that. Here, basically, it's a very easy utility to connect to any LDAP server and basically try to go through all the layout which is there. So in order to start with that, you just click on the connections and create a new connection. You specify whatever name you want here. Give the host. So in this case, our host is ss.labs. If you're talking only LDAP, then the port number would be 389. If you're talking LDAP S, then the port would be 636. You can also specify that using SSL option, it will change the port for you. In this case, in my lab, I don't have LDAP S enabled, so the 636 port is closed. And without doing anything else, just try to do an anonymous connection. This will give you, when you try to connect, it will give you an error saying it cannot because anonymous authentication is disabled on that particular domain controller. But you can see here, in order to, a bind must be completed with the connection, but it was not performed because authentication could not be happened. So you just click again on this and then you get all the other raw metadata, which is available by default for every domain which is there. There is, I couldn't find a way to basically stop this because this is required for AD to function. Let me, unfortunately, I can't find an option to zoom in here. But it will tell you lots of things like what all different partition, where all the different partitions are in the overall schema, the naming context, what is the current time on that particular domain controller. And another important stuff which happens to be there is the functionality level of the domain and the forest. So in this case, it will tell you the numeric values. 7 is 2016 server, 6 is 2012 R2, 5 is 2012. All those values are documented by Microsoft. Okay, I forgot to add that URL for that, but I'll show you the link for that later on. But all these values are documented by Microsoft for the numeric value to functional level, which one is which. Then another way is to get the same data is using the command line tool LDAP Search, which which gives you again the same data. Instead of using the GUI version for LDAP admin, you use the LDAP search. LDAP search is again a utility which you can install pretty much on any Linux system. Now, in this case, the parameters which I'm using are -LLLXH, and what all it means I've just documented here. Again, the same thing is done by other vulnerability scanners like Qualys and Nessus, and these are the QIDs and plugin ID for those. Now, you can get also a lot more information through NetBIOS over TCP. Does anybody know what NetBIOS is, or how does it play with name resolution? Okay, so NetBIOS is a very old protocol which is there initially when DNS wasn't there. So it was just a fallback when you don't find a DNS server, then all the Windows computers used NetBIOS to basically broadcast saying, do you know who this guy is? And somebody responds. It is still there in the latest versions of Windows because of backward compatibility. We can use that as an unauthenticated user to basically get more information out if NetBIOS over TCP is enabled on that machine, which is there by default. What things can you get? This is a basic screenshot of a utility called as NBTstat, which is again built into Windows, all Windows operating systems. Now you can target it to a specific IP address. So right now we only have one IP address, which is the domain controller. So if you send out this particular packet to the domain controller, it will tell you certain things as to what the name of that particular machine is. Is it bound to a particular domain and the current role? So here you can see you have the DC1 as the name, SOS as the domain name, and in one of them you can see 1C is listed as a type, which means that this particular machine is a domain controller. Now, if you want to do the same thing from a Linux machine, you can use a utility called as NMB lookup, which again gives you the same information. Then if you want to do a network-wide scan of that, then there is utilities called as NBTscan, which you can just, instead of typing each IP address manually, you can just give it a subnet, and it will send the packet to everything and list out all that information. So in this case, I'm running the tool on the 192.168.9.0 subnet, in which I only have two systems running at that time, which was the domain controller and the Windows 7 machine. Now on Windows, if you want to do the same thing, you have to download a separate tool and do that, because there's no built-in functionality in Windows using which you can do this. Then if you do a port scan for a domain controller, you would see certain ports which are open on that particular machine, but you would not find typically on other machines. Most relevant example is port 389, which is LDAP. Then the others are basically 366 for LDAP-S. I forgot 88, which stands for the Kerberos ones. If you find any of these three, then most likely it is a domain controller or running some other authentication service. Then latest ones, I think so 2008 2 onwards, whenever you add the domain controller, the ADDS role to the domain controller, it will start a web service on a port which is 9389. Which is called as the ADWS, which is used by the remote server administration tools, RSAT, by Windows. So whenever you're using PowerShell commandlets like get AD user, it is talking to this particular web service. Now, we have identified what the current domain is. We have identified how many machines are there in the subnet. We know what the domain controller is. How do you find what valid usernames are? And then we can find out the password for those. So these are again only some of the ways in which you can do it. There are a lot more ways you can find usernames, which include just Googling around, seeing what you can find on the net through OSINT, list of email addresses, extract the usernames from them. But right now I'll just consider this very small list. One of them is Null Sessions. Now, typically Null Sessions was there previously in 2003 domains, which was then by default disabled after 2008. But you would be surprised still how many domains still have got Null Session enabled, either because they forgot to remove the group policies which pushed that particular configuration but never removed that particular setting, or they just thought it is required and the system admin still enable that functionality. Then the other one is a network join printers. If you go to their status page, you would see the current status of the printers, but you also get a list of who is printing what. And that information most often times is available as an unauthenticated user. So you can just go there, scrape that particular web page, grab all the usernames, and then start a brute force attack on them. Then there are the others. Through Kerberos, you can basically send in the username, and there is a difference in the way the Kerberos service responds, and you can see whether a particular user is valid or not. And of course, the last one is if you have a unprivileged user, then you can extract all the information about AD. So how do you do null sessions? The most oldest one and still used is enum for Linux. It's a Perl script which works most of the times. You can get lots of details. It uses lots of old techniques like RID cycling as well to get the list of the usernames, groups, and a whole lot of other stuff. Now this is an output on my current test lab, which does not have null session enabled. But you still get this information because it is using the previous techniques which I showed you, which was the NetBIOS one. This is again the similar one. This is just target information, and it is here. It is showing it is trying to do a session check using the username as blank and the password as blank, but there's no output. Similarly, for the OS information, it is saying anti-status access denied because the username blank and password blank is not allowed to authenticate. But if you want to see how a typical output looks like, you can also run enum for Linux as an authenticated user and get the same information. So in this case, I've run it as a valid user, which is user1 with the password as password exclamation mark. And here at the end, if you see, you have got the domain SID for that particular domain, plus you have the OS information and the server type, and a whole lot of other details. So let me just quickly run enum for Linux. So -A stands for get all the information. So it has got options to get, so -U stands for users and other details. -A will basically run all the modules. So let me try a different user. Oh, right. Okay, what did I mess up now? Good. So yeah, I'd forgot to specify which server to run on. So here you can see it has got all the NetBIOS information and other things, but after this, it has basically got a list of all of the users. The way it gets this is basically it is making queries for specific RIDs, and it just iterates through all of them. So by default, it runs through the RIDs 1000 to 2000. Yeah, here you can see it is going through all of the IDs, but the result is unknown because those particular users do not exist. We have to do this because as an unauthenticated user, you basically don't know the RIDs. So the easiest way is to go through all of them and see which ones come back.
This is only possible when null sessions are
Yes. This is when null sessions are enabled, you will get all this information. But if null session is not, then you need to figure out a way to authenticate and get all the information. The other way to basically do the same thing is by using a program called as RPC Client. So let me quickly go through that. So RPC Client, you have manually specifying the user to authenticate as. In this case, because we are testing for null sessions, we are using double quotes. -n basically just says, don't prompt me for a password, and the target, which is the domain controller. So if you just want to quickly test, in this case, it would still show you the prompt, but whenever you try to run any queries, it will basically tell you access denied because this domain does not have null session enabled on them. So like, for example, enum DOM users which say access denied. If you want to see what all information you can get through RPC Client, you can see it has got lots of different modules which you can run and get the information. The most relevant ones for us are DS enum trust will give you all the trusted domains in that particular forest. The RID, then this is for the printer spool. SAMR, this will give you the list of all of the specific information about a particular user or a group. Enum DOM users, which is the one which I tried to show you before, which will enumerate all of the users in the domain. So this one doesn't use the RID cycling technique. So let's try to authenticate as a proper user. Then if you run enum DOM users, so this is basically all of the users in my current domain, and that particular RID is in hex. And query user. And if you query user for one particular user, it will give you all the other attributes for that user which is stored in LDAP. So like, when was that particular user's password last changed? When did he last log in? What is the description? So in this case, just to make it easier for me, basically said cannot change password as a quick reference for me that this particular user cannot change his own password. Then the other way to basically enumerate the list of the valid users is through Kerberos. Now, in order to basically use this particular attack, you need to build a list of usernames which you think are valid. So the way in which you can do that is through, again, go through all their LinkedIn pages, any job posting you see, any other emails listed on the website and things like that. From there, you can get either first name, last name list and figure out how to build username format and then build out and test script from there. So you can use Nmap to basically do that, which again there's a built-in NSE script which takes in a username list for you from you and basically tells you which ones are valid. Also, there is a Metasploit auxiliary module which does the same thing. Now, why does this particular thing work? Oh, I added it later on. Okay. So basically, this is a particular screenshot. No, this is an old one. Sorry. Let's actually run. I can show you in Wireshark why this particular thing works. So I'll quickly try to copy paste the command. So first, I'll build out a quick list of the usernames. So the typical usernames you would always find in an Active Directory environment are administrator and guest. So there is no reason to test for them. And then let's try some valid ones. So in this case, administrator we know is valid. Blah, foo, bar, 2 are not valid, and user 1 and user 2 are valid ones. And then so here the changes which I've made from the output is I added the domain name. Let me just pull it up. I added the domain name which we knew already, created the list of the usernames and which domain controller to target to. And here you can see it has discovered administrator, user 1 and user 2. Now let's actually see at the Wireshark traffic. So here you can see, can anybody see a quick difference as to why this particular thing works? Yeah, this one does. So 10 is our domain controller and 104 is our machine. So here you can see the first packet which we sent. Which is to the domain controller with these particular hashes. That's fine. So whenever basically you send in a request for a valid user, it will always return pre-auth required. The domain controller will respond with pre-auth required, but when it doesn't know what that particular username is, it will just tell you, sorry, I don't know. And that's the reason why you can use Kerberos to identify whether a user is valid or not. And the Metasploit module also works in the same way. Now, before we move on to password brute force, do you want to have a quick 5 minutes break, or shall we continue power through? Continue? Okay. So with password brute force again, I've selected only a few protocols to use. Active Directory has got a massive attack surface and lots of services you can use to again verify whether a particular user is valid or not. The only difference in each of them is most often times any protocol you use and you have got a lockout policy set and you exceed the threshold, it will lock the account. So even if you switch between the protocols, you first try to authenticate with SMB, then try RDP, then try Kerberos, and the lockout policy is set at 3 invalid attempts, it will lock out. So that particular account will be locked out. So the most common way to identify a particular username password pair is through Metasploit's SMB login module. Most often times it is taught in most of the tutorials you would find online, plus I think so a few certification courses cover this. Again, the basic is simple. You start up Metasploit, you use the auxiliary, you set certain parameters in this, which is the R hosts, which is our domain controller. You set up the SMB domain, which is our fully qualified domain name. You set which password you want to test. In this case, I've just configured to set as password 1, password exclamation mark. You can, instead of just setting a one username and password, you can do multiple combinations. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm testing one password against all the valid users I identified using Nmap before, which is set in the user underscore file. Or you can also do user as pass. So it will also check along with your password supplied, it will also check whether the username is the same as the password, the other way around. And you can also test a user pass file which contains the user and password separated by space, so you can then have multiple going on. Now, how does this look like once it's run? It will basically give you a green addition mark whenever it has found anything which is valid, and all failed attempts are in the red minus. So here we have identified one user, which is user 1, which is using the password as password exclamation mark. Sorry.
So can we use this for a brute force attack also? Like if I left the password field empty,
Yeah.
I use the password exclamation. If you left it empty, would it try all possible passwords?
You need to specify what passwords to use. So you have to set the password pass underscore file,
Right.
which contains all the different passwords you want to try.
So you have to provide it the list of passwords.
Yeah. Metasploit has got a default password list which you can use, which is there in their folder as well. But again, be careful with multiple attempts on a single user or multiple users because it will lock the account based on the policy. It is right now we haven't enumerated what the password policy is. So it is always a safe bet that you can make that the password policy is 3. So you can try 2 passwords and wait, and it won't lock the account. The most generally, whenever we are doing tests, the most common passwords we try is welcome1 or the company name and exclamation mark, or company name 123, or the season and the current year. And we have gotten almost 75% of the time. So let's see how does it look in Wireshark. So here you can see the failed attempt. It is trying to establish a TCP connection first. So you have the 3-way handshake. Then it is negotiating the SMB request and response. And then you're basically trying to log in. You get an auth failure. Similarly, when you have a valid username, you're going through the same step, initial step again, only except then you basically got valid authentication, and then it tries to mount the different shares on that particular system. And at the end, the tool basically resets the connection. Now, the reason why SMB brute forcing is not recommended as an attacker or a pen tester is because this is too much traffic and it is very loud. Every attempt you make will raise the 4625 event log on the domain controller, which is enabled by default. So any attempt you make, a particular event would be raised which contains the details of to who exactly tried to authenticate and the username as well. So here you can see the source network address is 192.168.9.105, which is just another machine which I had running in the network that time. Another one is RDP. Again, there are multiple problems with RDP. Firstly, that RDP is generally not enabled on most systems. And even in the case when it is enabled, what happened? The displacement of the sleep. So yeah, even when it is enabled, it is extremely slow because for every attempt, it is trying to create a separate remote desktop session, then trying to log in, then trying to see whether it works or not, and going through this again. So the entire thing of creating the session, logging in, finding out, that takes a lot of time, and that's why it's very, very slow. Right now, there's a utility called as ncrack, which has been recently updated, and the author claims that it is much more faster, but unfortunately I haven't had time to test how fast it is right now. Then, based on what you have seen, do you think Kerberos would be a good candidate? We saw in the previous Wireshark, even for a valid username, we only saw two different packets going through. One is the request, the other one was the status, which is whether password is required or not, or that the username is unknown. So whenever you use Kerberos to see whether a particular user is valid or not, it only sends in the request, and if you send in a valid password, it just sends you a response. That's it. So the entire checking of whether a username password combination is valid or not is very quick. You're generating less amount of traffic, and you're not raising any alerts. Which system is that? No. Maybe we need to restart it. I just stop sharing.
Yeah.
And then start sharing again. Yep. Yeah, no problem. So again, the guy who was telling you about who presented the fun with LDAP and Kerberos, he has made a shell script which uses the MDAL client's utilities, which is the KINet, to basically quickly brute force through and figure out which password combination is valid. Right now, it only works on Linux systems because it uses the KINet, which is a utility which you use to initialize a Kerberos authentication process. The code for that is available on this particular link. The dependency is that you need to just install the MDAL clients and start running it. You can run it again similarly like we did for the SMB login. You can run it either horizontally or vertically. So in this case, what I'm trying to do is I'm basically we have got the valid list of usernames. We're just trying one particular password on all of those users and see which one is valid. Now, like I was telling you, any authentication attempt you make, depending on the policy, it will lock out that particular user. So during testing and generating the Wireshark screenshots, I executed SMB login multiple times, and I ended up locking out the user for user. But I got a valid account which is user1 and the password is password exclamation mark. Now it did, in that particular file, I had 6 different valid users and finished in like milliseconds. But Metasploit takes a bit while, more than that.
So I'm curious, how did it log out the account even though you tried this one password?
No, because in order to generate the screenshots, I executed it multiple times and get that. Yeah. So why is this more recommended than using RDP or SMB login? As again, strangely enough, any invalid Kerberos authentication would still raise L4 624, which is that a user successfully logged out, which is not suspicious because he is authenticated successfully. So none of the security teams would actually raise any alerts if they are only relying on the 4624 and 4625, which is 25 is invalid login. But depending again on how the audit policy is configured, if you have this particular policy enabled, then an alert is raised, which is the 4771 with the failure code as 0x18, which means bad password. But so far, I haven't come across any large company who has actually enabled Kerberos logging and set up an alert for this particular thing. Although we are trying to spread the recommendations, and slowly we are seeing a few who have done that. Now this is the Wireshark log for one invalid and one valid one. Can you figure out which one is valid and which one is not? So 105 is our attacker machine, 10 is the domain controller. You're sending in a request with a particular username password combo. The response is pre-auth required. You send in the request, you get a response back. These are the 4 packets which deal with the authentication process. This is a screenshot of the 4771 event log, which I was telling you about. In this case, you can see the username is 5, user 5, coming from 105 IP address, and the failure code is 0x18. Now, I'll move on to the tool demo, the tool which I created. I also have, so I presented the tool last week at Black Hat and DEF CON. Do you want me to run through that slide deck, or just go through the execution of that tool and quickly show you what information it collects and how relevant it is? Because the slide deck is publicly available on the GitHub repo. You can have a look at that anytime. Which way do you want to go?
You can move on to demo.
Demo? Yeah. Cool. Okay. So I'll just quickly. This particular thing shut down. So the tool is called AD Recon. It's available on GitHub at that particular link. And if you go through the README page, it also has got the link for this particular presentation as well. So what is AD Recon? It's a very simple PowerShell script and some parts of it use C# code. What it does is it needs a valid username password combination to authenticate to LDAP, where it can then make LDAP queries and fetch all the information. What all information it gets is all the tree architecture which you have in a particular Active Directory domain, which is the forest, all the domains inside the forest, the trust relationships which that particular domain which you're targeting has. Then you have, if you have multiple sites and subnets configured in a domain, it will get all the list of those. What valid other domain controllers are there in the network, along with their sites, the SMB versions and other details. So I'll just quickly go through the execution of that. Now, right now, this is a Windows 10 VM which I'm running, which is not a member of the sos.labs domain. So that is why it is prompting me for the domain controller IP address or the domain name and the credentials. Or now, this is a Windows 7 VM, which is a member of the domain. So if you just execute it, it will use the current user's context to bind to the domain controller and basically start running all of the different modules and get the information. Now, by default, all modules are run except for the Kerberos module. I'll come to the Kerberos module later. Now, this particular VM also has got the remote server administration tools installed. So it is using the PowerShell command list from Microsoft to get that information. Now, once it is finished running all of the modules, it will basically, if again Excel is installed on that system, it will start up COM objects of Excel and then start interacting with it to fill in all the details which it found and basically create a few charts and other details to give you a quick overview. Now, for some reason, I haven't been able to figure out the Excel COM object takes a lot of time in this particular VM. That's why it seems that it's stuck there. But if you run it from this VM, and let's give it a credential. Now again, this VM also has got RSAT installed in it, so it is trying to create a separate drive for the Active Directory. It loads it in a directory called as ADR, and then starts running the Microsoft commandlets from there. And then right now it started the object and filling out all the different modules it found into the Excel report. And it is finished, so let's quickly open the report. So the report is basically divided into different sheets for each module and certain statistic sheets which it creates. The first is, of course, the table of contents, which gives you the list of all of them. let's go to the user sheet. So based on the all the information which it has gathered, it basically creates two different charts. One for how many users in the domain are enabled versus disabled, and I've just made a quick list of certain settings which we normally look for in a domain. So, like how many users in the particular domain cannot change their own passwords, or their password never expires. So basically, they're using the same password for a very long time. Then certain features which we misuse as attackers as well, like the SID history, constrained or unconstrained delegations. Then Kerberos with RC4 cipher enabled. It gives you a quick overview of how many users have those particular settings enabled. How many users have those particular settings, the users themselves are disabled, and the total count for them. And similarly, creating separate sheet for the computer accounts. Again, it will tell you how many computer accounts are created in the domain, and certain key settings which I look for in a computer account, which is the delegations, whether it's a constrained or unconstrained delegation, whether that particular computer account has got SID history, and whether that particular so dormant is when that particular machine hasn't been seen by the domain controller for the X number of days. By default, the script is hard coded to use the value 90 days, but you can specify a separate parameter and define your own dormant definition. The password age for a computer account is a interesting one. So whenever a computer is joined to the domain, the password, a separate computer account is created for that particular computer, and the password for that account is changed every 30 days. So if there are any system admins here, you must have noticed if you take a snapshot, let the computer run for a couple of days, more than 30, and then you revert the snapshot, the computer cannot log in back to the domain. So it will give you a message saying trustship lost. That is the reason, because the computer's password has been changed and the computer can no longer log in. So this is also a quick check which we use just to give a quick tell whether a particular machine is virtualized or not. So if you see the password age is more than 30 days but is actively being used in the network, it has to be either that the administrators have changed the default password length for that particular object, or that it is just running virtually. Then giving a quick look of the group memberships in the domain. So by default, this sheet has got different filters set. So here there's a filter set just to show direct user memberships. Then for the group name, there's another filter set which only shows certain groups which are treated as privileged groups, or are also known to be direct pathways for privilege escalation. Now, again, this particular thing is a pivot table. So if you want to quickly look at, okay, how many backup operators do I actually have? Just double click on that and it will pop out a separate sheet with those relevant entries. So in this case, I've got the backup operators as backdoor and BO user. Then computer roles is another interesting one where you can quickly see what all different things are running in your domain, and basically it's very short of an actual port scan. So for example, here you have the role as term server, which basically means that RDP is running on at least one system in the network. Then you have DNS. So in RDP would have the 3389 port open. DNS would have 53 open. Then you have LDAP, which is 389. So 389 port would be open. This can also be used as a quick way to see how many SQL servers you have in your environment and things like that. WSMin is PowerShell remoting. Then you have the operating systems in the domain. So this is also a good check to see whether the procedure which you have in the company for decommissioning computer systems, is it really following all the steps through? Because what generally happens is after Windows XP lost its support, everybody was in the rush to decommission all of the Windows XP machines and move to the latest one. They removed the computer, but the computer account is still valid in the domain. So here you can do a quick check to see what operating systems you are running in the network. And here I'm also giving the build number. So it's very easy to check whether they are also at a current patch level or not. Like for Windows 10 operating systems, especially the earlier versions of Windows 10 are not supported anymore. Builds after 1709, I think, so are supported. Right now, the current one is 18 something. Then this is the raw data, which is behind the statistic graph, which we saw. So here again, there is a filter set only to show enabled users, because there is no way you can abuse a user who is disabled unless you figure out a way to enable them. So what fields I'm basically gathering: the name, whether that particular user has to change his password at the next logon, whether can he change it, whether the password expires, whether that particular user's password is available in plain text on the domain controller. So it is stored in a encrypted format, but any privileged user can basically retrieve the plain text password for the user 5 in this case. Then whether smart card logon is required. So in this case, if it is set to true, even with a valid password, the CP user cannot log in unless he physically has the smart card. Then whether delegation is permitted. So this is a very interesting setting. Let me quickly jump on the domain controller. So this is the setting when I'm talking about whether delegation is permitted or not. Is the setting says account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. So this is a very important setting. Because even if an unconstrained delegation is set on any other account, but this particular checkbox is checked, any user cannot use it to log in through the delegation. So this is setting is actually recommended for all of your privileged groups. So even with a misconfiguration like an unconstrained delegation, those cannot be abused. Other than delegation, this particular setting has no effect, but it definitely reduces the attack surface which is available with delegation attacks. Then which particular ciphers are supported for the Kerberos authentication? Now, certain ciphers have got known weaknesses and are not recommended, such as DES and RC4. Then this is another Kerberos attack related to pre-authentication. So if it is enabled, then whether a particular user has never logged in. So what happens during new employees starting up, or other cases where a particular account is created but is never used. So this is a good indicator to see whether So generally what happens is system admins or the company uses same password whenever they create a new user and then ask the user to change the password later on. So that is the reason why welcome one works in a lot of organizations, is because those users have been created but have never been used, so their password hasn't been changed. So this, then you have the logon age. So this is basically just the calculation from the timestamp as to how long has it been since the user logged on. So in this case, I just logged on as the administrator today. So administrator is 0. And the other users have not been logged in. Then the password age is how many days has it been since the user changed his own password. Then dormant is whether that particular account has logged in more than 90 days. Same with password age. So in the password age, here it's 42 based on the password policy. So this is the maximum a password age which is there in the password policy. In this case, my domain has got 42, but some of them have got 90 days and things like that. So it will automatically change that to that particular day setting. Then whether user is locked out, is password expired, whether password is not required. This is the delegation. So if the account is sensitive thing is marked and you compromise the user, you cannot use its delegation to compromise the privileged account, which was marked as sensitive and cannot be delegated. So in this case, this particular user is configured with unconstrained delegation to use Kerberos on any authentication service. Logon workstations is whether this particular account has been restricted to log in to only certain systems. Admin count basically tells you whether this is member of the SD prop, SD admin prop, and is protected by that. The primary group ID, so it will tell you which group is treated as its primary member. The SID for that particular user, the SID history. So in this case, I've got a backdoor user which has got the SID history of the domain admin. So whenever his backdoor user is trying to do anything, he's treated as a domain admin because the domain admin's hash is in the password history. Domain admin's SID is in the SID history. Then the description. So most often times you also find administrators leave passwords in the description field because they think nobody can read it. Then these are the direct timestamps for which we had seen the number of days before. This will also tell you whether a particular account is configured to expire. This is different than the password expiry. And again, you can see the number of days as negative, positive, depending on whether it has already expired or will expire in the future. Then the email address, if the user has got its own home directory, if it's got a profile path, where is that particular path stored? Any scripts which are executed on its logon, when it was created, the timestamps for creation and changed, and the distinguished name. Similarly, you have the group memberships for each of the users. So it will basically give you a quick list of, so this is the group name. This is the member. If it is a group within a group, the account type will show as a group. If it's a direct user, it will tell as user. If it's a direct computer account, it will tell as computer. We have seen certain situations where for some reason, a computer account is added in the domain admins group, which doesn't make any sense. Then this is the list of all of the groups which are there in the domain. Similarly, it will tell you what the name is, whether the members of that particular group are again members of the admin SD holder, what kind of group category it is, what is the scope of that particular group, whether that particular group has been configured to be managed by somebody else. the SIDs for the groups, if there are any SID histories configured, the descriptions for each of the groups, when those particular groups were created, changed, and the distinguished names and canonical names. Then you have the user SPNs, which is the list of all of the users which have got the user principal name attribute configured. So by default, you will have at least one user which is got the SPN configured, which is the KRB TGT user, which is used for Kerberos authentication. But it is always that particular user is disabled. But this will tell you any others which you should look at, and it will also tell you the group memberships for that particular user. Now this is relevant because in this case the user account called as user is a member of the administrators group with an SPN configured. So we can Kerberos, we can ask for a Kerberos ticket to be generated. We can then extract a hash from the Kerberos ticket and then perform offline brute force attacks against that. To quickly show you how that looks like. So this is the sample output from the script for the Kerberos string attack. This particular attack was discovered and publicly released by a person called as Tim. Sorry, I forgot his name. Yeah, it was released in 2014 or 15, where he's basically showed a way to do these kind of attacks. This is just a re-implementation of some of the details which he had shown, and has been ported to a lot of different other projects like PowerView. This most of the code in this particular module is based on the PowerView module for that same attack. So here I have listed out the hashes for John the Ripper as well as Hashcat. So you can use whichever tool you want to do a password hash crack on this and get the password. Then you have the list of all of the organizational units which are configured along with this is a custom field which I've created called as depth to basically tell you whether there is nesting or not. So any nesting is there, it will change the depth from 1 to 2. Then you have the description when that particular OU was created, change timestamps, the distinguished name. Then the field which is the GP link. This basically tells you which group policies are applicable to particular OU. Then you have the ACLs module. In the ACLs module right now, I'm only dumping all the ACLs for the actual domain object, root containers, GPOs, and OUs. What you can see from here, let me quickly show you an example. Child execute, okay. So get changes and get changes all are two rights which you need to basically perform a DC sync attack. In a DC sync attack, what you basically do is create your separate domain controller and basically have it joined to the domain, so it syncs the password hashes with you. This attack is pretty easy to do using a tool called as Mimikatz. But in order to run and do this attack, you need a user which has got these two privileges. So in here, what I've basically done is I've got a separate user, which is, I think so this is the user 1123, which is the backdoor user, and I've granted him the permissions to do DC sync. Now, by default, the tool does not do the SID resolution in the identity reference field when it is run from a non-member, because it takes a lot of time to basically to translate the SID to an actual user. But if you run it from a domain member, the translation is automatically done for you, and we can see the backdoor user has that particular permissions. You can do the translation from a non-member as well. So let me quickly run that. So all you have to do is specify the tool with the parameter -resolve SID and true. It will run that particular module and translate the SIDs for you. So while it is running at the background, let me also when RSAT is not installed on a system, how do you run that? You run the same way like you normally would. In this case, I'm only specifying a separate parameter because I want to force the script to use the other method for authentication. In this case, this particular method, which is the LDAP, which it is using the directory services .NET class to make all the queries and get the information. So while it is creating that, again, the same thing for the computer accounts. It will get you all the information like the operating system with the service pack and the build number, the IP addresses for each of them, the logon age and password age, the delegations which are configured for each of them. Then you have the SID history, the descriptions, the actual timestamps. Then for the computer SPNs, which is the computer roles, it only gives you the name and what service it is running on what particular host. Then if you have got labs configured in your environment, now right now the password field is blank for all of them because this was run as an unprivileged user, but you can just still see whether any computer accounts exist with the last password stored. So we have 4 accounts where labs is configured. And if you want to see the actual passwords, we have to run it as a privileged account, which is a domain admin account, and then you can get the passwords in plain text. So this is the local admin's password on that particular account, on that particular host. Then you get a list of all of the DNS zones which are configured on your DNS server. You get all the DNS records, the list of all of the group policies which are pushed and configured. It also tells you where all the policy files are stored. Then the list of the domain controllers along with the site, the IP address, the operating system, and the different FSMO roles which are there for them. So in this case, you can see all of the 5 roles are only there on one particular machine because this entire domain has got one domain controller. Then you have the SMB versions which are currently supported. SMB version 1 is not recommended to be used even by Microsoft. And lastly, you have the SMB signing, which tells you whether it's enabled or not. Then you have the default password policy, which is applicable to all of the users. So here you can see the account threshold is 0. So irrespective of how many tries I do, I am not going to lock out any account. Now the default password policy can be overridden by fine-grained password policy, which is a feature added in 2008 R2, I think, where you can have a separate policy which is applicable only to a certain specific OU or a group which you specify. So here I've got a slightly stricter password policy for the members of the group workstation admins. Now, in order to enumerate this, you need to have a privileged account, because where these particular settings are stored is not readable by an unprivileged user. Then again, similarly, if you have multiple sites, it will give you multiple ones. In my domain, I only have got one site and one subnet. The name field will give you the subnet which is being used and added into your domain. So this will quickly give you a list of the IP ranges which you can target as an attacker. Then you have the trust relationships. So here the SOS domain trusts the PIM domain. Then you have the details for the domain. So you have the name, NetBIOS name, the functional level. So this is the translation of the numeric field which we saw earlier, which was 7. 7 translate to Windows 2016. The domain SID, if there are domain controllers, it will just quickly give you a quick list of all of the domain controllers. It will also give you a list, the exact date when this particular domain was created, and the red counts for the domain and the domain controller. And similarly, you have same information for the forest. I'll quickly show you the functional levels, the root domain, how many domains are there, sites, global catalogs, and the sorry, I'm losing my voice. The optional security features which are added by Microsoft. So in 2008 R2, they added the recycle bin feature, and in 2016 Microsoft added the privileged access management feature. So it'll tell you whether those are enabled and configured. And then the last sheet is just information as to what the tool is, how much time it took to run it. Now the tool supports, again, multiple output formats for you to quickly see. One is the console output, and then let me quickly show you the console one. So by default, if you run one particular module or specify certain modules, the default output set is to display the output in console. The other output formats which are supported by the tool are CSV is the default. CSV and XML, Excel are the default ones, but you also have the output in separate HTML files, JSON or XML. Each of them, each of the module has its own separate file with all the details in it. So you can quickly write or parse the information the way you want it to. So yeah, are there any questions?
So you would add this as an unprivileged domain user?
Yes, user 2 is an unprivileged user. Let me show you the group memberships for that user. That's the reason why it couldn't read the lab's password. Group members. Yeah, so it, it's running as user 2. If you see the member of, it's only domain users.
Why does Microsoft have to allow an unprivileged user to get into all these?
Most of it is, I think so, just related to backward compatibility and just to keep things running. Yeah.
User 2 is activated, then user 2 does not be user 1
And the password policy is applicable to all users, right? The default password policy. So even if he cannot query the LDAP directly, he would still know it because he can generate the resultant password policy for his account, which if they're not using a fine-grained password policy would be applicable to all users.
Can you run this tool with enterprise engagement or something, then they do something to detect
So a lot of people have got ATA configured to detect certain AD attacks. And in this case, I've got ATA running, and as you saw, I've been running the tool multiple times right now, and it hasn't raised any single alert as yet. But what you can do if you want to basically set up alerts for such kind of enumeration, which is again large part of this is also done by a tool called as Bloodhound, which is very popular now. It has much more capabilities than the tool, but the intention for both of the tools is different. The other one is basically just to see what attack paths are present in a network to escalate, whereas this is just information dump of everything which it can see, and then it is left to the user to figure out what is important for them. Let me try to log into the ATA console. But what you can do to detect such kind of attacks is basically, let me open up the properties for one user. Go to the security tab. So here you have the default, this is the security settings for any user account. You have the default one, which is privacy permissions, which control what that user can or cannot do. But you have the second tab, which is called as auditing. Here you can basically set up a special auditing policy, which says anything which basically reads all properties, basically raise an alert for that one. In this case, I was playing with it. You basically set it for everyone, and you can either set it for success or failure, and see what is actually reading the properties for any user. Now, this will always have, in my saying, I was playing with it, so I've got to check for the right ones, but you should do the read one. By default, you would see initially when you configure this setting, you'll still see certain accounts pop up because things like your printers or your Cisco call managers, Outlook, make the query to basically fill up their address book, which is basically an LDAP query to get all the list of the users. So you would see those accounts, and you would need to filter those out from your alert. And if you see any other account which does that, then there's somebody doing something for seeing what the environment has to. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so it depends on how it is actually implemented. So again, at Black Hat, Sean Metcalf gave a presentation where he was able to bypass CyberArk and one other product which had the 2FA implemented on them. So it all depends on how it is implemented. Any other questions? Yeah. I have run it against, so in my test network, I have run it against 50,000 users, but the maximum one which we have run it is 300,000 users. For 300,000, I took about 2 hours to finish. Yeah.
Any environments where ADA was running and we use this?
Yeah, so ATA does not detect the store. I was trying to show that. So this is the ATA console, and here you can see I've got a gateway running on the domain controller itself, and I've right now been running it for 3-4 times, and it has not detected anything. The reason for that is also it just sees that particular activity as, okay, somebody's reading all the data. And this is the alerts which you can see while I was configuring it. Let's see any activities for the user we were running it from, and it will say it has queried everything today from Kali, but it won't raise an alert. So unless you go into details and see the activities, you won't know that. I haven't played with ATA that much, but maybe there is a way in which you can basically see whether if whenever you see enumerated all users, then raise an alert. It could be possible, I'm not sure. But by default, this is the running it in default config, and it hasn't raised any alerts. But ATA does detect quite a lot of other attacks which are based on this reconnaissance. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Actually, we have some slides and because over here.
Hey.
Hi, my name is Anupriya.
Oh,
I do penetration testing
okay.
for EY. So I really like your tool, especially the way it presented, because it takes us so much time going through all the recon and like just combining the output from different tools.
Yeah.
Like that. But really good.